Good day to you. Very happy to be joining you on this beautiful afternoon walking across our campus. There's one side of it. Do you ever come out this way? You know, there was the bonfire for homecoming. Here's the pavilion I walk past when I walk past my house. Walk to my house, I should say. I don't know how often you get out to this end of campus. I'm really glad to be talking to you. I'm glad to be talking to anybody. That's the way that it felt when I was deep in coronavirus. There was a day where I didn't really know if I was going to make it to the next day. Couldn't breathe. Yeah, and in fact, I look back on that time period, which was not that long ago, and I am cleared to come back now and I've tested negative, as a time period where I felt actually very aided by mass media, by media in general. Because I had a year and a half to study what the effects of the pandemic would be in terms of catching COVID. And I kind of knew what was coming, even though you're never really prepared. And I got it, even though I'm double vaccinated, even though I wore a mask almost everywhere I went, even though I was in virtual isolation for a year and a half. I got COVID with 8 straight days of fever and a lot of other symptoms that were really severe. So I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate all of you putting up with that video last week. I don't normally like to, or I don't ever like to present an old video as my current teaching, even if it's from last semester. You know, teaching is, in my opinion, meant to be organic. It has to be in the moment. So I'm walking across campus today, and I thought it was fitting anyhow to have a video where I'm walking and talking, because we're taking on this chapter in the book that takes a turn that embraces what we're doing here. It's cultural analysis. It's the next chapter that we're taking on here. And it has come to be known as a very intellectual method of analyzing media, because the thinking that's required is pretty concentrated. It starts out in an area of study in England, actually, in the Birmingham School. It's a northern town in England. It's known for manufacturing. The Industrial Revolution came out of Birmingham at the same time it was coming out of the U.S. Big manufacturing town, right? So you have this university that grows up taking a look at that and all the horrors that came about, and they eventually came up with a way of thinking that's today referred to as cultural analysis, even though they didn't refer to it as cultural analysis. And it looks at the study of culture. It looks at the study of culture, and that includes looking at not just high culture, like symphonies and ballets and art, but also looking at, we're not going to say low culture, but pop culture. That would be what the mass media produce, right? Any song whatsoever by Bruno Mars is going to be pop music because of the virtue of his popularity. And so when we're doing a cultural analysis, we definitely look at all kinds of culture. So what is the main focus of cultural analysis? The main focus is what human beings produce, with our own hands, and the means by which we preserve what we have purchased. Okay, that's a different thing than making things. Purchasing is using a currency to buy stuff for your own possession or for others. That's a completely different way of being, so to speak. And so as we get into the subject and it starts to already become kind of obtuse and abstract, what we're really looking at is the way that we live our daily lives when we're doing a cultural analysis, and how media are within that daily living performing different roles for us. That's what we're looking at with a cultural analysis. And like most of my lectures for this class, I don't use a lot of media examples, because that's what I want you to do. That's what your job is in the class as a student in media criticism, is to be doing the application of the concepts that we discussed in media. I don't want you copying my examples. All right, so let's talk about the different dimensions that go into performing a cultural analysis of any media form. And we've got 3 different types. First of all, 3 different types of culture that we're looking at. The first is physical culture. Physical culture, the artifacts and the natural environment that are around you, just like right here. I'm losing my breath a little bit here because I'm walking up a hill. It's a sunny day, but I got a jacket on. I'm getting kind of hot. There's a clatter of leaves, as I'm dragging my feet through them, getting up onto the sidewalk. Our physical surroundings, these sidewalks, the hills, the buildings, that has a big impact on the way that we live. I can tell you, having lived in England where spaces are much smaller. Apartments, rooms, hallways, everything smaller. People sit closer to each other as a result. Here, we take more space because we can. Anyway, next on the list of types of culture is social culture. Social culture, or the social norms that govern the use of artifacts in the environment, the social norms that govern the use. Like as I'm walking down the street here, it's pretty litter free. I won't say completely. Like I look up there, that's an ESU related party house, I believe. I've seen students up there partying. I'm not trying to stereotype ESU students, but maybe it isn't a coincidence that there's trash on that lawn, right? And that's a norm. It's a norm that it's okay if you're a student, or it's a norm if you don't live in a town, or it's a norm if in your family people would throw things on the ground, cigarette butts, etc. That's what we're talking about here. They're not laws. They're norms. Like when you come to a door, do you hold a door for somebody, or do you let them go in? I mean, has COVID changed that? I don't know. Now we move to the third type, which is attitudinal culture. Attitudinal culture, these are customs and laws and traditions. Customs, laws, and traditions, they're more strongly enforced. The expectations are more carefully and directly laid out. Sometimes there are penalties for not complying, like that car right now. Driving down the highway, if it was doing 75 miles per hour, and there was even an ESU police officer, they may pull him over. Right? Actually, before this sidewalk was here, when I first moved to ESU, 2 female students were killed because there was no sidewalk. They were walking on the highway, and a car came over the hill, and they didn't have a chance. Horrific story. So I don't want to end on a bad note there, but it's, again, relating back to infrastructure and our physical environment and how that affects our culture. No sidewalks, you have to walk and share the road with the car. All right, next up we're going to talk about qualities. Qualities of performing a cultural analysis. And the first one that we want to consider is when you're looking at a culture, whether it is more individualistic versus more collectivistic. So we don't do a lot of talk about that in the United States because we're an individualistic country. At least we like to portray ourselves that way. Rugged individualism. Was one of the most important themes of the 1700s for any person moving to America, to be a rugged individual. And we have a lot of individual liberties. Like, this is private property. I'm not able to walk on that person's house. It's private. It's that person's individual place to live. But there are countries that have more of a collectivist nature to them. More of a collectivist. Socialist countries, for example, have more of a collectivist nature to them. So, for example, in Sweden, a course where I'm teaching, a country where I'm teaching a course this coming summer. If you don't know about it, I just sent out an email to all majors. I'm teaching comparative media there. Sweden, one of the most beautiful, clean, and I have to say free. Like, people there are really free. It'd be hard to believe, but it's a socialist country, and those people are taxed very highly. So they pay over 50% in income taxes. A lot of money. But they have the most amazing bus services. They have perfect sidewalks. They have bike paths, not lanes, entire paths through the countryside for you to get from point A to point B a couple miles away. Beautiful ride. And that's because it's said to be in the interest of the people, the interest of the collectivity of the people of Sweden. So the individual pays taxes. So we look at that when we look at a cultural analysis. Just going to let these cars pass so it doesn't get too noisy here. Cars, they're actually trucks. All right, so now we're going to move on to the next quality of a cultural analysis, which is there is a rhetorical quality, building on what we learned about last time, a rhetorical quality, which says that in life, certain things function symbolically, that they are symbols for things. Like this tongue on my jacket, that's the logo of the Rolling Stones. Most people know that, whether you know a single song by the Rolling Stones. It's become a symbol. It stands for something else. So that's what a rhetorical analysis does. It looks at the symbols that are involved in communication. And then there's also a quality of a historical quality. The historical quality means that there is a context in which situations occur. I'm walking past a fraternity house right now. the Sigma Pi fraternity house, I have tremendous context with them. 30 years ago when I moved here, there were 2 cars that were burned in the parking lot. It was a dangerous place at Sigma Pi fraternity. In fact, they even had their charter pulled for 5 years. But that's a long time ago. The people in there now, they are very respectful, and I love to see them out playing ball, shooting hoops. There's one going up the stairs right now. Maybe you know him. Anyway, I have a history. There's a historical context with me in that Sigma Pi fraternity. And you will find that is also occurring in media usage. Again, we need to remind ourselves without using examples of media that this is a media class. And then lastly, and perhaps the most difficult to understand, is the ideological context. The ideological context teaches us to see what is good or not good in the world, to see what is good or not good in the world. I used to have one view of vaccinators and anti-vaxxers, as a for example. That view used to be, if you're an anti-vaxxer, that's your right. Just like a woman's right to choose, in my opinion. You can do with your body what you want. Nobody can tell you what to do. But now that I've had COVID, I think differently. I think people should have to be vaccinated. Yeah. So context changes and ideology changes. Ideological qualities change. In other words, belief systems about what is right or wrong. All right, now we're going to head on to functions of ideology. We're going to take that term and expand it a little bit. And a way to look at ideology in a very plain sense, to understand it at its most basic level, is it is simply a way of seeing the world. It's just a way of seeing the world. That's what an ideology is. You can say religion's an ideology. You can say that music is an ideology. You can say sports is an ideology, if it kind of frames your outlook on life. So when we look at ideology, we want to break that down further. And the first way that we can look at ideology is in terms of the limits and the enhancers. The limits and the enhancers. That is, how does it hold back some things but promote other things? For example, if I was to ask you who the Prime Minister of Canada is, could you answer that? Even though Canada is only 7 hours away by car, even though Canada is our biggest trading partner with the United States, even though Canada has mostly an English-speaking nation like us, even though Canada is a friendly nation to us, can you name the Prime Minister? Why is that? Is it because you're participating in an ideology of a country that does not show much interest in providing even basic information about other world leaders? That really what we are mostly providing information about is ourselves in the news and in sitcom scripts and reality TV shows, that you never see the Prime Minister's name of Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, mentioned, right? So ideologies can limit our knowledge, right? But they can also expand knowledge. As I discussed earlier with COVID, I felt fairly well prepared because of media and what to expect. I even learned how to sleep. I learned that when you have COVID and you can't breathe like I couldn't, you try not to go to sleep, which I didn't. I was afraid to, but you lean on your side and you stay straight up. Yeah, I learned that. So there's limits and enhancers. Next up is that ideology normalizes certain aspects of the world. It normalizes certain aspects of the world. For a while, it was completely normal in this country for white people to paint their faces black and to perform in entertainment acts. Amos and Andy is one of the most famous radio programs from the 30s, the 40s. It was very popular. 2 white guys painting themselves, not only painting themselves with black faces, but also acting out stereotypical characters that made them out to be buffoons for the most part. That was normalized. How could that be possible? By today's standards, we look back, we're like, what was going on? That's bad. But then it was normalized because it was a popular show. It was people. And my question, whenever we study incidents like this, is what are we going to say 50 years from now, looking back at 2021? Are we going to say, I can't believe that was normalized? And finally, we changed that. So we do look at how relations are normalized. And sitcoms, there's a very I would say, general way of showing how to resolve relationship problems is always done in a calm, nice talking way. I can assure you that people do not get along that way most of the time if they're really passionate about their disagreements with others. They don't solve things with a nice, calm tone like they do on sitcoms or even soap operas. So that's normalizing behaviors. All right, now let's move up to another function of ideology, and that is a function for interest groups. It provides a way for them to express themselves, interest groups. And the interest groups can come from almost any dimension of society that you could think of. It could be like royalty, as the book talks about. That's not one that's not that relevant to our day and age, unless you're living in England or Sweden. We have the issue of tradition. Tradition is something that is talked about when the Confederate flag is talked about. The people who defend keeping it in public spaces say, oh, it's just a tradition of the South. There are those who say, oh, no, it's not. It's a symbol, rhetorically. It's a symbol of enslavement. That's what it is. Like, we need to get rid of it. So you've got two different ways of looking at that particular issue and informed by two different traditions. And wealthy and elite and basically the privilege is what we're looking at here. The privilege, the people who have the power, who have the money, the white people, the males for the most part, those people have privileges over other peoples, minorities, poor people, immigrants, criminals. Now you may say, of course, criminals, but we have to include that in the mix. So when we're looking at functions of ideology, we look at, for example, if we look at racism in the United States, I saw a very interesting documentary on Netflix that talked about three waves of racism. The first one being slavery, the second one being the Jim Crow laws of the South afterwards, which many of them were finally done away with during civil rights legislation. And then the third wave is incarceration. It's incarceration. In Pennsylvania, I read over the weekend that if I'm remembering right, I may not have my stats completely right, but they're pretty close. According to statistics released by the state police in Pennsylvania, in 2020, we had a population of approximately 12% African Americans. But if you look at incarceration rates, it's around 24 to 26% of incarcerated individuals are African Americans. So there's a 12% increase there. How can that be? How can that be? This is where ideology comes into play, and the performance of cultural analysis is because you can look at those structures. You may look at the judicial system. You may look at the police force. You may look at actual incidences of crime among black community members. That's up to you how you want to construct the argument. But the point is ideology is looking at which groups have control over other groups. All right, let's move on now to a whole different side of the chapter, and it has to do with ideological processes, and this is how ideologies become adopted by a culture, how they become adopted. And so one method of adoption is through the myth. Like, that word, right? That's a myth. Like, if a student is waiting for a professor to start their class and the professor is 10 minutes late, the student can leave if they're an adjunct professor. If the professor is 15 minutes late, the students will have to wait 15 minutes if they're a full professor, and then they can leave, right? No, that's not right. There's nothing about that anywhere in any university. Okay, that's a myth. It's a myth. It's a sacred story. It gets passed around in an institution. It preserves certain norms, certain ways of behaving, and it provides a guideline for how to act. In this case, how long to stay in a class, even though it's not true. My opinion is if you're 5 minutes late to a class, and even 30 seconds for me is late, the student has a right to get out of there. All right, next up is an ideological process is doxa. Doxa is knowledge that is beyond question. That is, the ideology takes this knowledge and says, it's going to put it over there. It can't be touched. Can't be touched. For example, let's take the issue of chemicals in your life. I'm not talking about methamphetamine. I'm talking about your bathroom. Are you at all aware of what you're putting into your scalp every time you take a shower and massage shampoo into your hair? How about dyeing your hair? How about anything that you do to the skin, the biggest organ on the body, or your eyes, or eyelashes? Eyelashes are not well, they are living, they're organic, but they're, have feeling. There's no nerves in those. Are those different? What are we talking about here? We are talking about doxa. Being able to discuss whether our common everyday cleaners, and I've only mentioned in the bathroom, I haven't even talked about the kitchen or the garage, those everyday cleaners, that knowledge is beyond examination. Why? All those important companies, the Procter and the Gambles of the world, etc., they're very powerful. So any kinds of studies into toxicity levels, cancer levels, just plain bad feelings, they're going to be blocked by lawsuits and all kinds of other stuff. That's what we are talking about here when we are talking about doxa. It's knowledge that we just don't even question. Some, myself would be included in this, and no offense is meant, would even say that religion is doxa. If you tried to talk to a person about their belief in God and ask them to provide a rational set of evidence that you can examine, they'll say, I have faith. Well, faith is saying that that's doxa. The knowledge is beyond examination. You can't examine, you just have to trust that there's a God. Now, I'm not meaning to denigrate that. Everybody has a right to choose whatever they want, whatever path they want in life. But I'm trying to show you how clever, or not even intentionally, the doxa becomes. It becomes in plain sight, but yet it is hidden knowledge. You can find lots of examples with that in your life. Lastly, an ideological process we want to discuss is hegemony. Hegemony, kind of a funny word to say. Hegemony is a process by which one ideology subverts another ideology. It's a process by which one ideology subverts another ideology. If you take punk rock, for example, I don't know if you know much about punk rock. It was a movement in the 1970s. The biggest band was the Sex Pistols from London. Punk rock had a very abrasive sound to it, very chaotic, lots of screaming guitars, not necessarily melodic at all. When it first came out, it was anti-establishment. It was all about overthrowing the Queen. They even had a song, the Sex Pistols, called God Save the Queen. It was totally cynical about keeping a queen in today's day and age in England, somebody who's so rich. It was all about anti-establishment. It was about actually a reaction against rock and roll. It was about, we don't want to follow the stodgy traditions of bass players and league. They want to go crazy. They want to go chaotic, right? That's how it was. That was the original ideology. But then punk rock got overtaken by drug abuse. And many of the punk rockers who were involved started ODing on heroin, like Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. So it's like the ideology of junkiism and drug use took over the ideology of anti-establishmentism. And that's what you look at when you look at, that's the kinds of things you look at when you look at hegemony. It's how one power structure gets subverted. When I think big on this one, I think of when the Spanish got to Mexico. The Spanish got to Mexico, which was full of indigenous peoples like the United States. And some of the indigenous peoples happened to have built pyramids. The Aztecs. Yeah, they were in Mexico. They built pyramids. What did the Spanish conquistadors do in the name of Catholicism? They smashed the pyramids, or sometimes just built right on top of them. They built a cathedral, their religious symbol, right on top of the Aztecs' religious symbol. And that is a real good example, I think, of hegemony. All right, now although that one's a forceful kind of hegemony, and hegemony is not always, it kind of sneaks in there sometimes. All right, so now we're going to talk about two processes which were developed to look at when you perform a cultural analysis. They were developed by the main authors for this field. We have Ray Williams and Raymond Williams is his full name, and we've also got Stuart Hall. I like to highlight Stuart Hall. He's one of the early African-American scholars in the field of communication. He grew up in Jamaica, and he went to the School of Birmingham, Stuart Hall. And both of them together came up with two ways of looking at media content using a structural analysis, using a cultural analysis. The first is structuralism. And structuralism is coming out of Marxism. We've kind of been hinting at Marxism throughout this lecture, right? When we talk about money and the exploitation of people, it's really coming from Marxism as its root. But when we perform a structuralist component to the cultural analysis, we're looking at ideology, power, privilege, and oppression. All those ways of controlling people that I alluded to through my past couple examples, those are structuralists. And then those are countered by culturalists.
And culturalists are looking at the particular beliefs and the activities of individuals in a given culture. You're looking at particular beliefs and activities. So if you look at Americans on 4th of July, you're looking in their backyards and they're barbecuing. They're making hamburgers, hot dogs, and they're going to have fireworks later, and they're going to have family over, and it's going to be an outdoor fair for the most part. That's an individual belief, but the overall structure that might be there is one of patriotism. That on the 4th of July, you are expected as an American to demonstrate your patriotism to the country by participating in the celebration of fireworks, which are a symbol of bombing the enemy. Yeah, that's fireworks are a symbol of that. And red, white, and blue, symbol of the flag, symbol of your identity as an American, and what the flag is purported to stand for. So this is an interesting way of dividing up cultural analysis when you look at culturalists, the individuals, and what they're doing and how it fits in with the larger structure. All right, now let's go to the final two ideas for today. The next one being ideology and media representations of class. Ideology and media representations. What we're trying to do here specifically when we're drilling into media criticism, we're trying to look at media content or texts. That word text we're going to be using throughout the remainder of the course. Text does not refer to what you're sending on your cell phone. Text is the content, the specific content. It could be a sentence. It could be a text. It could also be a soundbite from a sitcom. It could also be a graphic from a web page. They're all examples. That's what that word text means when you're a media critic. So when we look at ideology and media representations of class, we look at how popular media texts, which is to say the mass media, right? They're not promoting symphony, they're not promoting ballet, they're not promoting intellectual game shows. You may think Jeopardy's an intellectual game show, but it's not like it could be. How the popular media texts communicate, justify, and maintain, here's the kicker, disproportionate socioeconomic status divisions. Disproportionate. So why don't we have more equality in the United States? Why do we have people who are so poor and people who are so rich? When you go to the country I'm taking my class to, you don't see the monstrous mansions and you don't see any homeless at all. I mean, that's up to you. Maybe you want a mansion. I mean, don't get me wrong. You have plenty of Swedes driving around in BMWs in their signature car, which is the Volvo, and living very high standards. But you don't have what we have here. Every time I pull up to ESU, there's a guy standing at the corner. God bless the police. And he's looking for some money. You've seen him, probably. Get off the exit. So that's what we're looking at here. And what is it about our system that preserves that, right? It doesn't allow that to be fixed. And one of the components of this diagnosis of looking at ideology and media representations of class is to look at the size of what is known as the petit bourgeois. The petit bourgeois. And I'm not going to tell you what that is, right? You're going to have to take a look at that and guess why. Yeah, you probably can't. All right, next up, we want to take a look at in the U.S. There are two prevailing representations that are talked about in our media, either directly or indirectly, which help to represent class in our country. So one of them is the American dream. And that is the dream that everybody has, that you can become rich no matter what. But actually, probability-wise, if you look probability-wise out of the number of people we have, like 340 million people in the U.S., the probability of people who do end up actually becoming millionaires is very, 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 very tiny. But yet most people aspire to the belief that they can achieve that, right? So that's a myth that helps even a person who's working 3 jobs, working as a dishwasher, working as a street cleaner, working as a babysitter. Even that person still trying to pay their debts. They still believe they can become rich, even though odds are they never will be able to. Not to be pessimistic, it's just the facts. That's what representation, that's the power of representation of the American dream, and keeping a disproportionate socioeconomic status there, keeping the people who are working the hardest in some ways at the lowest end of the earning scale. And then next up, we have the idea of class distinctions in the country. So we don't have it like Britain. We don't have it like India, where you have to marry into the same caste, not the same as a class, but the same caste, similar idea, in order to be accepted. But still in the United States, we have big city people who look down on country folk and vice versa. We have black people who look down on other black people, and white people who look down on black people, and black people who look down on white people, and white people who look down on other white people. We have suburban people looking down on everybody. I'm being facetious to some extent, but we tolerate that, right? We accept that there are different class differences. The fact that I'm a professor both limits and enables a lot for myself. When I go around and introduce myself in an everyday crowd, well, what do you do? I'm a professor. Oh, silence. What do I say around this professor? I don't like that. I have to put up with that because of the class distinction. And one of my favorite authors had a lot to say about this subject. His name was Thorstein Veblen, Veblen, Thorstein Veblen. And he wrote about this concept called conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is where we consume stuff in public so that we can impress others. We make it obvious in public. So if you have a car, you not only drive that car, you put the top down and crank up the volume so that everybody, look at that person driving that nice car. Now, you may not think of it that way, but that's what conspicuous consumption is. And one area I think it hasn't been applied to very much at all is in social media. People putting so many details of their, in many cases, wouldn't you agree, mundane lives on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. Here I am at this restaurant. Here I am with these friends. I mean, I'm really glad that people are having a good time, but a lot of people think that is very interesting. And, there has to be more to it for me to be interested, unless it's somebody you really know well or you haven't seen for a while or other circumstances. But I'm just talking about the amount of personal consumption that is put on Facebook and Instagram for others to see, to impress. That's what ideology and media representations of class look at. And now we're going to finish up with our final thoughts today on media, ideology, and representations of race and ethnicity. Yeah, we've been hinting at that. Now let's get into it. So we got whiteness going on, a lot of whiteness. That means of the people who are represented in media content, the vast majority of them are white. Should the percentages align with the percentages of minorities in our country, ethnic minorities and other kinds of minorities? That's for you to decide. It's a moral question, but whiteness speaks to the fact that it's out of whack right now. More white people than there are white people proportionally in the country. And of the positions and statuses that they are represented in more flattering roles and functions than people who are not white. I mean, the whole show Cops that was on the air for years, I couldn't believe that show was on the air from the first day I saw it. And finally it got taken down because of the Black Lives Movement, I believe. But I mean, just think of how black people were constantly portrayed in that show if you've ever seen reruns. So next up is exclusion. And this is where events are just written out of history as if they didn't occur. That's what is really interesting to me about the pandemic. What is going to be written about the pandemic? What will not be written? Will the names of every single person who passed away from this, will they be written? What about the doctors who saved lives? What about the doctors who passed away saving lives? Is that going to be written out of history? We'll have to see. Next up, we have stereotyping. Stereotyping is, there's always a truth to a stereotype. I'm Scottish. People can say Scottish people are cheap. And I can say that's not really right. We're frugal. We learn to live with what we have, and we can be very resourceful in creating. You want me to get the top off of your beer bottle and you don't have an opener? No problem. I've got the bottom of my shoe. That's Scottish people. That's not the same as being cheap. It's being frugal. It's knowing how not to waste your resources. Now, is there some possible truth to that cheap idea? Yeah, there is. It means that we won't just spend money willy-nilly. And that's the way that stereotypes work. There's a tiny kernel of truth, but unfortunately they reduce people. And that's the problem. They reduce people to that stereotype. And that's a problem. You talk about Jews, when you talk about blacks, when you talk about white males, and say it with that kind of tone, right? Now you're being stereotypical. So we look at stereotyping, which is misleading or reductionist views. That's what we call it, the reductionist views of individuals and the groups that they belong to. But then we also look at assimilation. Assimilation is sort of the opposite, and that's how minority groups are stripped of their cultural beliefs because they are adopting their new culture's beliefs. They're stripped of their own cultural beliefs and they're adopting new culture's beliefs. Now, you may not look at it that way. You may look at it as, hey, if Puerto Ricans are moving to the United States, they should be speaking English. You may think that. And that's perfectly valid, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about when your culture is being absorbed into another culture, you're stripped of some of your beliefs. When I grew up, my dad was always saying, no talking at the dinner table. I never understood why. I thought that was a great time to talk. But that was his Scottish, British background. And he couldn't control it because every house that we ate over, we spoke at the dinner table. So he couldn't control that rule. We were being assimilated, or we were having cultural traditions associated with British people stripped from us. Functioning within assimilation is a term that's used called token. A token is a character in a story who is supposedly there to prove that racism or any other kind of oppression does not exist, but they don't have a big impact. They don't have a big role. They are a token character. The token homosexual on a show, the token transgender person on the show, the token Hispanic, the token Asian. If you're in any of those groups, you know what I mean. It's not real. It's like portraying that you're attempting equal representation, but you're not. You're just throwing it in there to fool people. Next up is othering. Othering is it's a mechanism for marginalizing minorities. It's a way of making them weird or different or strange or abnormal. And that's what transgender people have been arguing actually very vocally for the last 5 years. I mean, I don't know if Caitlyn Jenner finally provided that popular mass media opening to bring the subject before enough people that it got critical mass that then others could finally start to express similar feelings that they've had. And among those feelings included being othered, being weird or different. You're not gay, you're not bisexual, you're not homosexual, you're even different from them. You are othered, and you're weird and you're strange. And that's what othering does. It makes you feel like you don't belong. I'm not a person who's going to feel a lot of othering in my life because I am a white male. And I do have a college degree. But one area I do is I'm an atheist. And I get made to feel very strange by religious people a lot of times for my belief system. People even tell me, God bless you, when I sneeze, without even considering whether I'm religious or not. And there's doxa, right? It's knowledge that's not examined. No, that should not be said to a person who doesn't believe, in my opinion. All right, we're going to finish up finally with exoticism. Exoticism is portraying foreign lands. I'm laughing here. It's portraying foreign lands and images as being primitive, quaint, or even animalistic. And that's been done to most of Africa. Oh my God. Oh my gosh, I should say. Sorry. When you look at Africa, a lot of your knowledge of it may be based on a documentary or a very rare film footage, or maybe you've seen a news report. And the way that people in Africa are often presented is jumping up and down in a way that makes them look animalistic, makes them look primitive. They're not in houses. They're not wearing shirts sometimes, looking quaint, rather than people who may have a cultural tradition that has a value that you're not even taking a look at, like the value of community, or the value of communicating through song, or the value of common bond, which is even different from community, or the value of passing on knowledge from one generation to another. Or the value, a really big value in my opinion, is getting rid of all the materialistic goods that you're saddled with, like insurance payments and cell phone bills, and just being in the moment with the earth. Those things are not talked about because of exoticism. People are portrayed very, very strangely. Ask a Mexican what they're thought of in the United States, and there's going to be questions about, are you part of a drug cartel? For sure. Ask a Puerto Rican, it might be knives. I'm choosing the worst stereotypes on purpose here because I'm trying to show how strong exoticism can function to other people. Yeah, all these terms work together. All right, so a little bit of a longer lecture today, trying to make up a little bit for our last class. I certainly hope you have a great day and consider some of these ideas from cultural analysis as you approach your shortcoming and near future.